Perfect. Okay, great. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I think we'll be okay on time. Christy Everett, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, want to talk about some lessons learned with a rain garden we did in Norfolk, Virginia. So just a little bit about what CBF, what Chesapeake Bay Foundation is focused on. We and many others, probably many of you in this room, are focused on reducing nitrogen pollution, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, part of the Chesapeake Bay Blueprint, or the watershed implementation plans, or WIP. You see that word. It's not a whip as in crack the whip. It's a watershed implementation plan. And you can see we have some kind of steep reductions if we want to meet our goals. We've done a lot of work with point sources, and now our state in particular needs to really focus on non-point sources. So stormwater pollution is not something that you're probably haven't been working with. Obviously, it's causing nutrient pollution. It's carrying nutrient pollution into our water, as well as bacteria, toxic chemicals. It's one of the major sources of impaired waters in our region, in Hampton Roads, and then of course causes flooding as well. Lots of reasons we and many localities are wrestling with this new emerging challenging issue of stormwater pollution. Actually, if you look at reduction of stormwater pollution, so on the left are pounds of nitrogen, you want those pounds to go down. We've been increasing stormwater pollution in Virginia. And so we've got steep declines. You see that red graph? If we want to meet our goals for reducing stormwater pollution, we've got a lot of work to do. So big focus of our work, probably many of your work I see by nodding heads. So that brings us to kind of how we're thinking about design and redesign of our cities. So typically we used to just get that stormwater off as quickly as we could, of course, right? You have gutters, curbs and gutters, you send it off into a culvert and then right into the creek, stream, wetland area, get it off the streets as soon as possible. Now we know better because that creates polluted water and isn't keeping up with flooding issues, of course, water quality and habitat. So re-envisioning the way we accept stormwater, whether it's coming from rainfall. And of course, with climate change, we have more intense rain events. So we have these cloud bursts, so more extreme weather events and more of that stormwater coming in more quickly. And then, of course, it's coming up through the river, the streams in our region through the stormwater system with aging infrastructure. So looking for either private or public property that can retain, detain, or infiltrate, particularly infiltrate, that improves water quality the most. And of course, it's holding in areas that hopefully are maybe a recreational amenity during those hours that it's not holding flood water. Hopefully it's beautifying an impoverished area. But the gist is it's putting it in the right place and not allowing it to go in the wrong place, which is what's happening in many of our localities. We also know that historically conservation groups have been engaging the wrong, really the wrong part of our community. We have been really focused on whoever would be interested. This is typically not communities of color. And we haven't been engaging and working with as much those communities most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, the effects of dirty air, dirty water. So really trying to do more to engage the community. You can't protect water quality if you're only working with a small portion of the watershed residents. And the folks here just haven't really had a voice in protecting their community and haven't really been advocated for in terms of issues. In particular, in our area, flooding is something that's affecting many of these communities, and they're not really able to develop a lot of the solutions that that we feel like are going to be important to protect and allow them to function and go to school and work and things like that. So trying to broaden our engagement. With that, we worked with Elizabeth River Project. We've got two folks in the front here, so great partners. And did a few different conservation practices, working with certain portions of Norfolk that we had not worked with before. You can see here, Rain Barrel. I think this is actually from a Elizabeth River Project. We combined efforts to figure out who would be interested in installing these to get some of that stormwater coming off the rooftops. as well as some shoreline plantings. I'm going to talk about a rain garden next, and then a tree planting I'll tell you about as well. So with that, we started working with Purpose Park. The Teens with a Purpose is a youth empowerment organization. It is a nonprofit organization. It is supported by the city of Norfolk because they own both the community center that they work out of and then the land that is where this garden is. It's really just a vacant lot. You'll see a picture of it from space, and it's in an area that floods. It's an area that is historically redlined. So if many of you are familiar with that practice, it looks like that it was disinvested. The investment was discouraged historically. Very low tree canopy, extreme heat island, high levels of emergencies related to heat-related illnesses, an area that's just not getting the attention and the investment that it has historically. I'll play this quick video just to show you about how this community is a partner, and just kind of, I think you'll tell from Deidre, she's a Teens with a Purpose director, her passion, enthusiasm, and just how she really elicits that community love and support.
So today was at 2017 with 2 raised beds and a half an acre of gravel. And now it has trees planted in the earth, not just a raised bed. So this area we're standing in, I'm calling the orchard. Okay, that's because I have a vivid imagination, but we have apple trees and now peach trees and fig trees all in this section, and then we have magnolias at the entryway and cypresses on the end, and teenagers just really dug in and made it happen. And our partners with Chesapeake Bay Foundation put the whole project together, got the trees, got the city to dig up homes for us, and it's magic happened. So we're making the community greener, prettier, healthier, and more vibrant. And that's all anybody wants, is to live in a beautiful space that feels like love, and really it is. I'm really grateful. This was amazing. Thank you.
So the teens are from a local high school. We did have some challenges, particularly with COVID, working with the students. Of course, in the beginning of COVID, we didn't want to interact with anyone. Actually, one of the girls passed away from COVID as well throughout this time period. So it was challenging, but I will say the most important part of the project was engaging the teens. We were finding that we wanted to move very quickly. We wanted to work with the tree planting season, which in our area is pretty much December through late February, March, but taking the time to stop and engage the students was a really critical part. So I had to be much more patient than I usually was. So that's advice that I would say. I'm glad we slowed down to do that. Again, trying to work around different seasons and different deadlines can be tricky, but it's one thing I highly recommend. The little dots you see are pinpoints that the students did by using something called a Bad Elf collector app. So using ArcGIS, they were able to learn this technology. It's a very handheld device. You can see on your phone where you are, and it uses GPS coordinates. So working with them to decide where they wanted the trees based on, as you saw in the video, creating this space for the community that was welcoming. They have gardens, so providing a food source, but really just helping them understand how their space can beautify and be part of the community was a really important aspect, that engagement. So having them put the tree species based on where they want them literally on this map was as a key important part. The site was highly compacted. As Deidre mentioned, the city was fortunate enough to come in with an auger to get through that soil. That was critical, and they could use that map that we just showed to identify that those sites. We had community members as well participate that were not part of the Teens with a Purpose, which I think was in a really important composition of that community engagement. The plants are doing well. Again, we tried to work with that growing, when the trees were dormant in before early March. We didn't make that deadline, or they ended up being in April just because of some delays, but we put tree gators around them, a really important kind of aspect to ensure that viability. And then they water them each Saturday. So they have got that stewardship, and engaging them in the planting and the design helps with that investment for the maintenance. Question? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I'm going to get in a little bit of the soil too with the rain garden. We did have to do soil amendments, and again, there is that compaction. It was a somewhat limited tree planting, and so we didn't do measurements with many sites. This is a previously developed site. With many sites, it's so compacted that root structures can't even get through it. I don't know if anybody went on the Slow the Flow tour yesterday. Ann Jerzyk was doing a tree planting under a former pavement site. She's adding biochar to allow some of that breakup for an oxygen for root plants. We have not seen that limited growth. It was typically gravel put on here, so you didn't have that intentionally compressed soil. But so yeah, we didn't add any amendments that would break it up. So as I mentioned, a little bit of the site history. It was previously developed. It was a lettuce packing factory. The city tore it down, and it's under-resourced community, and it's got, the soil is not healthy. It was either fill or, again, compaction. Virginia Tech had worked with the group to do a site assessment, and I think that really helped the students realize, gosh, where water's collecting would be a good area for a rain garden. So they pointed out that portion of the area. We calculated 17,000 square feet of drainage area. We use LiDAR data to better understand topography on site and that slope. So if many of you have built rain gardens, you know that slope is an important factor, as well as, of course, soil type and hydrology, and that drainage area to determine how deep and how large you want your rain garden. The students were able to use that Bad Elf collector app and then put it in the GIS system to plot out where this rain garden would be. It's an important skill set. And then we tried to, in a creative way, engage them in the planning of where the plants would go, the shape of the rain garden, kind of use that traditional bean shape. They broke up into groups and kind of had a competition of what they report, how those plants should look. So we talked a lot about how things would have different colors and during different parts of the season. Some of them wanted grasses that had different elevation that would look, I think actually this group wanted grasses that had a different elevation to look like a wave. They wanted to put the letters TWP, Teens with a Purpose, in it. So it really kind of was exciting engagement and ownership, but just really involving them in what they would be maintaining was a critical portion. And again, this is when it was, you go fast by going slow for me, that we had to stop, take the time to connect with the teens. They only meet Saturdays. Some Saturdays they had events. And so we would, have to wait weeks and weeks for that engagement opportunity, but it was worth it when looking back on it. Here is the plant list. I don't know if you all can see that. We could zoom in, but it's got the flowering plants designated, and that was based on those color patterns, what they wanted to bloom during certain times of year, what they were interested about. So they learned about flowering plants, grasses, and then we were able to fit in things that they seemed interested in, or at least color patterns, things like that. These are the foundational plants. So trying to get a little bit more, it was a large rain garden. So typically rain gardens are 150 to 450 square feet. This one was large, as I mentioned, 1,200 square feet. So it was so large that we had some capacity in the center for trees, as well as some bushes and shrubs. So again, working with the students to design what these plants look like, why native plants are important, their value in terms of habitat, water quality, pollinators, and what species were where. When we did the planting, we also handed them laminated copies of these planting plans and flags and said, now point, in the garden where this plant should go. And then they got in groups and really did that planting preparation in a very tactical way based on these planting plans. So it wasn't just that a plant was done, the planting plan was done, we got the plants and then assumed it all kind of worked. We really wanted to take time to have them be involved in the execution of the plan as well. This is excavation. I won't make you watch a video of a ditch digger, though that does sound kind of exciting at the time. So typically with rain gardens, you would maybe put matting down to kill the grass, or you would take that grass and roll it up. We did use some of it for a berm area. This was so large and the soil was so challenging that we used the City of Norfolk Stormwater Division as a partner. And so we were able to do this much more efficiently. It wouldn't and couldn't have been done probably on our own. So again, taking the time to work in a partnership with the city, in this case, the Stormwater Division, sometimes Parks and Rec, it's been a partner that's been a really critical aspect of the success of this process. And this is after it was excavated. So many rain gardens will they'll put in outlets if there's excess, or an under drain. We chose not to do an under drain because we wanted to try to keep the water on site if possible. And we thought with the drainage area into this realm, we would have that capacity on site. Again, we did do a berm along the back end of the property to kind of hold that water in. And we excavated 4 feet, particularly to loosen up the soil, put some of that material back in, and then added some soil amendment to increase the drainage capacity, as well as some mushroom compost to provide more nutrients. And then we had 3 inches of rain in 24 hours. Later that week, I actually left my sunroof open during that. So I don't know which was worse, but don't do either. So what we found is that so a typical rain garden, depending on your soil type, maybe it's more than 6 inches, 6 inches minimum, more than 6 inches. But if you have sand or good draining soil, sandy loam, maybe you can go foot-ish. Depending, clay, you would keep it smaller. What was already probably deeper than we should have had settled in this rain event. It was a very unusual rain event, 500-year storm event. But the ponding was too deep and the soil was not amended to the extent where it was draining as ideally. We did do an infiltration test after that first excavation. We probably should have done more of the infiltration tests and done them more time. So it can't hurt. Infiltration test is you dig a hole about 12 inches, you wait 24 for 48 hours. You can do some calibration there in the beginning, but those infiltration tests are really going to test, or it's like a perk test to make sure that you're infiltrating like you should. And again, ours ended up to be more of like a pool because of the shape and the depth, and as it settled, that layer just really kind of compacted even further. So we actually had an issue where we couldn't plant. So we did change some of the plant composition. We put more wet foot plants in, not at this stage. We still couldn't plant at this stage, but we did change our composition to put more wet foot plants, but it became a vicious cycle because, as you can imagine, once you have plants in there, especially once they're established in a few years, they will be encouraging evapotranspiration. They'll be holding more water, but we couldn't even plant or they just fall over. So real big challenges there as well. So we added a terracing system as well. We did more leveling, and then we added more soil amendment to increase that drainage. We still ended up with water. We had some heavy rain events that week. Every time it rained, we kind of froze and hid in the closet and said, like, please stop raining. But we just had a wet spring. Again, after that second terracing and amendment, we leveled, but as you can see, a portion of it continued to sink, continue to hold water. And so added more soil amendment. So finally, we were, I think, at the right depth. Again, no more than 1 foot, and we probably should have added additional soil amendment beginning, reduce that excavation. Again, very unlucky because of weather, but those are some really important aspects of it. So as I mentioned, the first planting those foundational plants that we put the students, they gave the students the flags. They put the flags, you can see a little marking on the flags of which plants go where. They went out there, made sure the design was consistent with the planting plan. They went over, got the plants, came back and put them in their grouping. Several community members came as well as the students of all different ages. So really fun to mentor. Even the teenagers were mentoring some younger students. This was our second planting day. You'll see in some of the lessons learned, we should have built in rain days for any planting day. We did not. So we learned as well. So it looks like 2 planting days, but there were probably 12 false starts where we were going to organize it, wanted to wait to see if it dried out, couldn't reach out to volunteers because it was too late, and it became a very frustrating cycle. So maybe really mapping out plan A, B, and C would have helped prevent that, given the weather challenges as well. We did about 1,200 plants on this planting day, all of those flowering plants. We intentionally, I'll just say, we intentionally planted things closely together. So, we didn't put rock in this garden because we didn't want the students to have to get in there and move the rock and have to fiddle with it too much. We wanted to have a really dense body of plants. So they will crowd out eventually weeds to minimize the weeding for the students and make it a little bit simpler because it's going to be so much to maintain. I will just say, definitely could not have done this without partners. I mentioned the city of Norfolk with a lot of that labor. Working with partners can take more time. So when we worked with the city of Norfolk, we had to do an MOU with them that took months to get it on the council agenda and get approved. It was worth it in the end, but building that time into a timeline would have been very helpful. This partner here is the Virginia Tech Agricultural Experiment Station. Critical when we didn't get our MOU with the city in time. We said, okay, we've got 1,500 plants. What are we supposed to do with them? They're in the back of my car. They offered to babysit them for the winter in their greenhouse. So those partnerships are just so critical, so important. Feel very fortunate. So just some things we learned with this site. So while you can, in an area like Norfolk, you have high water tables and many urban areas, you have compacted soil. It's not ideal for rain garden. In general, you want to use the soil on site if you can, because, native plants are acclimated. But in this case, it was probably good for the berm, but just needed more soil amendment. So really kind of working more with the soil, I think would have been critical up front. Just more amendment. You can use obviously more rock layers and things like that as well. But given the scope we had, we were trying to minimize that addition. Again, we had some rubble as well because these sites were previously filled. Our ponding depth was something that was really important to consider, and again, just got worse because of the additional precipitation. Several days of planting in a row, so just making sure that you've got a plan A, B, and C. You can always cancel volunteers later, but it's hard to call them at the drop of a hat for a Saturday. That fine grading, it was important, I think, for us to do it, and making sure that we were going out there and doing that and managing the site before these storm events was something that we would have needed. I talked about soil amendment, and then that perk test, multiple perk tests on such a large site in different areas of the site, I think would have been better versus one and done. Many of you may do a ribbon test if you're doing a rain garden that helps you understand the hydrography of your soil. So that as well as another technique to better understand the permeability. And then trust your gut and keep a positive attitude. Probably very strong reminder of not to get overwhelmed by something that's not on schedule and feels like it's dragging out, particularly when you have live plants and you're trying to get them in the ground before the summer heat comes. In the typical rain garden, I just want to go over this because ours was a little bit different. So if you're doing a home or kind of a more traditional rain garden, identifying where the water is collecting or could be rerouted from like a downspout disconnection or adjusting a gutter. Calculate your drainage area by the roof width and length. You don't need to worry about pitch. Doing that soil infiltration test. So a foot deep for 24 or 48 hours, depending on if you've had what kind of precipitation in the area. Trace it out on the ground, see if there's extreme slope anywhere. I've got a guide in here that can help you calculate based on slope, based on drainage area, based on soil type or hydrology, how deep you want to go. So slope is an important factor. In Hampton Roads, we're flatter than many areas. Avoid a foundation of a structure. We didn't have to deal with that in this, but you want to be about 10 feet or more from a foundation to not cause issues. Obviously, mark our utilities just before digging. Once you excavate, using a level system to ensure that you are level, and then at least about 6 inches to paste it in your soil type for that depth consistently. So some plants don't go dry while others are wetter. Amend that soil to act as a sponge. And then there's additional materials you can do if you have extreme drainage that you're expecting, extreme slope based on those calculations. And then obviously you putting your native plants and pollinators in, making sure the wet-footed guys are where they want to be, and the drier, et cetera, sun and shade are issues as well. If you have a downspout, disconnect to connect that and add that water source. And then the thick, heavier mulch, about 2 to 3 inches, because some of it will decompose. First few years, you're going to have to do more watering and weeding and checking after storms. And then once it's established, life should be a little bit easier, but definitely checking on it. With the systems we used was Department of Forestry Rain Garden Technical Guide. If I clicked on it, I could show you it's got a lot of those calculations built in to better understand if you're designing appropriately. That's key to make sure you've got the drainage capacity. And then I put here the emails of my colleagues. Katie Grigsby helped with the design. Renee Jennings helped with kind of the working with the volunteer group, Teens with a Purpose, and that was helpful to kind of divide and conquer. And then there's my email as well. And we have an ArcGIS story map that also has some of the information of this presentation as well that tells a story if you want to go back and look at any of the details. And with that, I think we've got time for questions if there are any. Yep, go ahead, Mary. I get the mic? I'll bring the mic over.
Working? Okay. I was wondering in regards to the Teens with Purpose orchard, since, you know, I live in Norfolk and I kind of always wonder about my garden. You said that area used to be like some sort of packaging plant?
Lettuce packaging plant.
Do you guys like test or anything to make sure there weren't any like harmful chemicals in the soil, since I presume people will be eating the peaches?
So that's an interesting question. There are community gardens there that we didn't plant. You probably saw them in the picture and Deidre referred to them. And I believe they bring in soil for those raised beds, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. We did add some soil amendment, but that's a good question. I can check with Katie, who did the tree planting, to see if it was in the,
And I only ask because, like I said, I live in Norfolk and I always wonder about my garden. I'm like, I know there's rubble down here. I'm like, is there lead or anything? I don't know.
yeah, that's a good question.
And then I had another question. It might be more of a Katie question, and I can reach out to her. Do you know if you guys went through like the clay layer for your rain garden?
So I think that was potentially part of the problem. So we did do 10 feet deep with an auger to look for water table and didn't find a water table, just to test it. And we also looked at some water table mapping, USGS, not sure how accurate that was. And water table was apparently not an issue, but we think maybe on part of that rain garden, again, it was so long and large that there could have been a clay layer. Or wonder whether that's under one of those sides, that west side, that could have been causing problems and holding it. So,
Well, I'm excited to go and see it. So one of these days I'll go look.
good. Yeah. I will say, for your question about community garden, I know my colleagues worked with a church, and again, this was on the Slowing the Flow trip yesterday, to take off a roof, take off rainwater from a roof cistern and hold it in there, and then use it to water community garden. And if it's a black roof, I guess with asphalt, it can have PFAS in it, which can be obviously harmful with the consumption and as it biomagnifies in the vegetables. Their roof was a rubber white membrane system. I think it was newer, but I will say that that can be an issue in some areas. So something that I've learned from that process. Sure.
I had a question about monitoring. Are you working with Teens with a Purpose to do any monitoring after the fact for the rain garden? Because they're the ones doing the maintenance. Are they looking for any pollinators this summer, or birds that are wintering in the garden, or looking at how it does over the next few years?
Yeah, so we have said, we've talked about having the teens send us a picture quarterly or bi-weekly. This is part of their garden where they work every Saturday. I don't think, and we've given them a maintenance plan. I don't think we actually, that I know of, has said, let us know if you see species. But I think that's actually a much more engaging question and exciting. And I think that's a great idea. And if we're not doing that, I'll tell them, because I think that's something that could make them care more, get more excited, instead of saying, go look for weeds. So I actually think that's a lot of fun and something that is a fantastic idea, and I'll pass it along. But
can you talk more about working with the teens and like the recruitment, incentives, lessons learned about just working with that audience?
sure, yeah. I will say they don't all arrive at 9 a.m. sharp on a Saturday morning. We learned that. So they get there slowly, so that's one thing, is we'd be like, okay, we're going to start at 9. We'll be finished about 12:45. And that didn't happen with the teens. Some of the community members were there at 9 a.m., but we really realized that it's a different pattern time scale. I mean, I think we all remember being teens, and not 9 a.m. on Saturday is not a likely thing. I think they did do a site check-in. This is something that the Teens with a Purpose director does and their program does. And they have a really great framework where they have mentors. They kind of have a leadership ladder and staff to be more engaged. It's not just one director working 7 days a week, trying to know everyone's name and what's going on. But at the site at some point during the plantings and the designs, they would do what we call a check-in. And so you'd go around the room and you check in and say, how are things going? Scale of 1 to 10. Things are going great. I'm a 10 today. And really kind of just listening and acknowledging that they're there. I think was really, really cool. I do think what I've heard is, you don't just call them teens, but try to get to know their names. Just to kind of give them, sometimes when you're an adolescent, you have that invisibility. And I think these kids struggle, but it's the Teens with a Purpose organization that is there in the most important partnership. I will say, if we didn't know about the structure and framework, I can't imagine trying to work with teens individually. I think it would just be very hard to manage. So those existing groups and those existing partnerships to me are much more successful when you're trying to reach out to new community groups. Just going out in the community and trying to catch people and then consistently engaging them is not going to happen without going out there and seeing which coordinated efforts are already there. And it's not always the same teens, of course. So having to kind of remind folks, this is what we're doing today. This is what we did last time. This is where we are in the linear path is also critical.
I just wanted to follow up on that one. In terms of like engaging the Teens with a Purpose group, was there any way to incentivize that partnership or like compensate them for helping out with the work?
Yeah, the students actually, the Teens with a Purpose organization has a grant and the students are actually, they're like interns, but they're called hip turns. It's just a cool way. And so they are paid. So they're not, having to work another job where they couldn't be in that organization. So it's the Teens with a Purpose website. Happy to share that if you don't find it online. It's got a lot of information about their programming, whether it's art. They do yoga in Purpose Park on Saturday. They're out there working, they're out there doing maintenance, but it helps that they're funded to be out there, whether it's Saturday or after school. So really important program. And again, that partnership that made it happen. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all very much.